What's going on, guys? So when you see a trailer like this that has basically 8 tires in the back, you kind of wonder sometimes, why doesn't my RV have 8 tires in the back? Why do I just have, tandem single rear wheel axles? Well, let's talk about that. I'll be right back. So a lot of people ask that question, and the simple answer is you really don't need it. When you look at a gooseneck style trailer used for hot shots, first of all, you need redundancy and you need payload capacity. And typically the payload capacity of a trailer that has dually tires on tandem axles is much, much higher than what a fifth wheel or an RV would ever be spec'd out to. Also, you're dealing with weight being placed in different places on that specific type of trailer. If I'm going to load a skid steer on the back, or if I'm going to load an excavator or something on the back of that trailer, it's going to be moving across the back of that trailer, and it's going to change where that weight is at any given time. Which means if I have a lot of equipment loaded on, I could be meeting the capacity of 4 of those tires at any given time. On a fifth wheel, you don't really have to deal with that, because a fifth wheel, 99% of what you have inside is static. It's not moving. You're just bringing stuff and adding it to it, but you're not bringing enough to really have a need for that type of weight distribution carrying load across that many tires. So if you look at the tires that I have on here, these are J-rated tires. They have roughly a 6,000 pound capacity per tire. And if you look at just the 4 we have here, that's 24,000 pounds worth of carrying capacity on just these 4 tires. Well, if I had dually setups on this specific RV, well, you're talking 48,000 pounds worth of carrying capacity on those tires, which is, it would be insane. It just wouldn't even be needed. So if we drop down to like a G-rated tire, and let's say we have a 4,080 pound carrying capacity and we had 8 of them, you're talking 32,640 pounds worth of maximum payload capacity on those tires. And again, it's just not needed. If you have them on a hot shot style trailer, you very well may be loading, like I said, a skid steer or an excavator that has to roll from the back to the front, and it's going to put a much greater load on any of those tires at any given time, depending on where that tractor is. And that's something you always have to account for, right? You have to account for where the weight is, where the weight's being placed at that specific time, and where that weight might be transferred to. Also, the redundancy of that many tires is good, and a lot of people would say, well, that would be nice in the RV industry, but again, it's generally not needed. Typically, you don't see major accidents occur because you have a blowout on an RV tire. What you might typically see is, one tire goes out, you pull over, swap that tire out, and then whenever you get to where you're going, you check the rest of your tires to make sure you don't have another blowout. The other part of it is simply a construction perk. Going to this type of setup means that you can put more stuff between the frame rails. The frame rails don't have to be as close together. You can position more holding tanks, which in my case, my freshwater holding tank is right here. So I have a freshwater tank and 2 other tanks here, a gray tank, a black tank, and another gray tank right here, which give it the ability to have kind of a universal style tank that other manufacturers can also use. So there's a lot of reasons why RVs have this type of setup. And again, with the running gear I have, I'm looking at 24,000 pounds worth of maximum cargo capacity on just these 4 tires. Now, I know a lot of people will say, well, what if you don't have J-rated tires? If you're running G-rated tires, well, then that's roughly 16,000 pounds worth of maximum carrying capacity. And even then, that's usually going to be well and above what most RVs are going to have sitting on them, at least 80 to 90% of them. Now, you may have a toy hauler, and in that case, they'll put a 3rd axle on to be able to handle, upwards of 20,000 or 21,000 pounds worth of gross vehicle weight rating. If you move to something like a Lux or a DRV with a 24 or 26,000 pound gross vehicle weight rating, you might also see a 3rd axle, or you'll just see a higher rated axle with larger running gear designed for that specific type of payload. But again, mainly you don't need that type of setup. You rarely see axles fail. If you do, it is generally very rare, and it's usually because something was overloaded or there was just a defect with that specific axle that you got. Out of the millions of axles that are sold to manufacturers, there are bound to be some that are just defective or that might have some inherent problem. That being said, I personally wouldn't want to have dually tires on my RV. that's just more work you have to put into them, more work checking the pressure, more work replacing tires. It's a greater cost. You're going to wear through more tires at any given time. And if they have axles and tires that are rated appropriately for the RV, then I'm perfectly fine. And I think that's where most people probably need to focus their attention on, just making sure that you're looking at RVs that have the type of running gear that's appropriate for the weight. And a lot of people get into this length thing where they think, well, an RV is 44 feet long or 42 feet long, it automatically means that it needs to have a third axle. And that's not true at all. Basically, your axles are going to be dictated by the weight, how much weight is resting on them. It's not necessarily to avoid frame flex and things like that. On toy haulers, maybe a little bit, simply because you're usually going to have something heavy over the very back. But on your traditional fifth wheels, it's always going to be based on the weight of the fifth wheel, mainly the gross vehicle weight rating, how much weight it could be at under maximum load. You know, whenever you see RVs that are real long and you're like, man, that thing really needs a third axle, again, it's just not needed. And by having a third axle, you run into a scenario of what's called axle drag, where when you turn, that third axle is typically dragging and it's wearing on the tires, it's wearing on the actual hubs, it's wearing on the bearings more than if you just had dual axles. You get a little bit of it even with dual axles, so having a third axle can sometimes be more of a pain than it's worth. And if cosmetically you're thinking it needs a third axle, that's your only reasoning for wanting one, then that's not necessarily a reason to put a third axle on. It all, at the end of the day, comes down to weight. It comes down to how much weight can the axles handle, how much weight will be applied to them whenever they're loaded up, and what type of wheels, tires, what type of running gear are on them. That's really what you have to focus in on. And you basically want to say, what is the gross vehicle weight rating of my RV? So if I look at mine at 17,500 pounds, what's the dry weight of my RV? And let's just say it's 14,000 pounds. What's my total axle capacity? With twin 8,000 pound axles, that's 16,000 pounds. So I'm already 2,000 pounds above my actual dry weight of the trailer, and I'm about 1,500 pounds below the actual gross vehicle weight rating of my trailer. But whenever you look at how much weight is actually going to be transferred to the back of the truck and how much weight I'll actually have on this RV, we'll probably at most have this thing weighed down to maybe 16,000 pounds whenever we're towing it. We're never going to be at that magical 17,500 pound. At least I can't foresee us ever being at that number. So whenever we factor our weight, you know, we're 2,000 pounds heavier than dry. 16,000 pounds is essentially what the axle capacity of our RV is. And our tire capacity is 24,000 pounds, so we don't have to worry about that there. And basically deduct about 3,000 pounds in terms of pin weight that will transfer to the back of the truck. So what does that mean? That means at any given time, we'll only have about 13,000 pounds actually resting on the axles. And with 16,000 pounds worth of axle capacity, that means our axles are going to have 3,000 pounds in excess over what we'll ever actually be putting on them. And that's the way you have to factor it. You have to factor it practically. And even then, the manufacturers of the axles build a little bit of overkill into them. Not that you should ever have to use that, because there are other forces at play when you're going over certain types of roads, whenever the thing's bouncing up and down and you're hitting potholes, all of that. That's typically why axle manufacturers build that excess into their axle construction, is because it's accounting for roads that might not be ideal, or, you know, again, just how the actual RV is being towed over certain types of conditions. So at the end of the day, you don't need dually tires on a fifth wheel. They just aren't needed. You don't really need a third axle on a fifth wheel just because it looks long. You typically have a third axle because of the weight, or if it's a toy hauler, and you do need a little bit more of that support towards the back. But in reality, it's not typically something that's needed on most fifth wheels, especially non-toy haulers. Anyways, guys, I sure hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't had a chance, please take a moment, subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and we'll talk to you again very soon.